An interesting quirk about GBO2 is that sometimes one major update can have a drastic effect on gameplay as a whole. And in GBO2's sordid history, I don't think any update ever hit quite so hard as the nerfs to transformation and flight system. Both abilities are still fantastic in the current meta, it's just that neither one of them is broken anymore. To give you an idea of how this particular change came about, a little bit of a history lesson is in order. During the first ranked event, something I keep bringing up, I know, somewhere like a third of the player base were using two suits, specifically the Assault Gun Tank and the Hildefer. At the time, both of these suits were under cost. What was making them so powerful was a quirk of how the transformation skill worked. If you're not familiar with this skill, there's two versions of it, a flying version and a ground-based version of it. They both work basically the same way. Hitting the button puts you into a high-speed movement mode. During this high-speed movement mode, you will continually build up heat in your boosters, and you can keep it going until you cancel it or you overheat. While you're in high-speed mode, using your boosters will cause you to do a ramming attack, which will allow you to do a bit of damage just by slamming into enemies. The airborne version of this skill will essentially give you the ability to fly. The skill works exactly the same now as it did back when it was a problem. So, what happened? Well, the answer is a quirk of the knockdown mechanics. If you're not aware, in GBO2, if you are knocked down by an enemy, when you get up, you have a few seconds of invulnerability. This is mostly to prevent you from being cheesed, but there's a couple of quirks to it. For example, tackling, dodging, or using a weapon will immediately end your invulnerability. What did not end your invulnerability back in the day was the transformation skill. Among other things, this meant that, say, a Hildefer or Assault Gun Tank, which just got up from a knockdown, could immediately transform and proceed to yeet itself out of the area with no real ability to stop it, running over enemies as it went. Flight System, meanwhile, had the exact same problem. Activating it did not end your invulnerability, so there was literally nothing stopping you from disengaging from a combat that did not go your way. A later update made it so that activating any special mode immediately ends invulnerability, regardless of the type of special mode. The main difference is that transforming suits are still used all the time. Flight System had a near-complete die-off. And it's really weird because, on the whole, suits with Flight System are still very viable. In fact, most of them are pretty awesome. However, they're not absolutely broken anymore, and that's enough for most of the player base to just simply eschew them. However, as I have established in many videos now, the majority of GBO2's player base are idiots. Many of them will stare headlong right at an awesome suit, and then immediately ignore it because it's not a current bleeding-edge meta pick. And that's a bit of terrible decision-making that will absolutely screw you against today's entry. And that entry is the Gouf Flight Test Type. Also known as the Gouf FTT, it is a 350-point general that is both ground-only and ground-specialized. It was the first suit that was introduced with Flight System, and surprisingly, it's still relevant even today. A lot of this comes from cost. The Gouf FTT comes out in a very, very preferential cost bracket. At 350 points, it is the only game in town as far as flying suits go. And it goes to 400, where it still enjoys a firepower advantage over other flight suits that are just coming in. When it first came out, it was nearly a perfect suit for mix-up. Back when 550 was as high as suits went, it being a 400 and having a very unique skill set besides, meant that a lot of players wound up using it just because of what it could do, and it was very effective there. A little of the sheen has worn off, but you're still looking at one of the best generals at 350. It manages to hold its own very effectively against many of the meta picks of its generation. It still has to worry about them, but it can go toe-to-toe with many of them. Its primary weapon happens to be one of the most ubiquitous ones in the game, the good old giant bazooka. 16 suits in this game use this weapon. And while the Dom is almost unquestionably the one who made it popular in the first place, the Gouf FTT may very well be one of its best users. Its linear trajectory, splash, and very long range makes it an excellent weapon to use from the air. There is another, far more important reason that this is a centerpiece of your offense, however, and that reason is ordnance combos. The Gouf FTT is one of those rare generals that has a bazooka, but does not primarily rely on a blue-zooka strategy. Instead, the FTT takes advantage of one of its secondary weapons, namely its rockets. Hit with the primary bazooka shot and the follow-up rockets, and you can kiss at least 25% of your average enemy suit's HP goodbye. If you're a raid, it's more like a third of your HP. The rockets are also very useful as an area saturation weapon, and they do reload rather quickly, but the biggest use for them by far is that ordnance combo, because that's where the majority of your damage comes from. Backing up the bazooka and rockets, you also have dual finger machine guns. Accurate, decent range, good amount of ammo, good rate of fire. Both usable as a plinking weapon and your main suppression tool. And lastly, the single worst weapon on this suit, blow. This suit has no melee weapon, and as such, it relies on unarmed combat. Melee priority 1 is a really good reason why you should never rely on this thing. That said, it does have a couple of uses. For one, the Gouf Flight Test Type works really well on the ground. Every now and then, you will run into some raid trying to crowd you or some blue Zuka trying to get the better of you. When that does happen, the backswing on your unarmed melee is a really good get-the-hell-off-me tool. It's also really good for disrupting enemy supports if you can land in the back line. The problem is, again, the damage is low and the priority is atrocious. That said, you absolutely will wind up making use of it whether you want to or not, so by all means, get some practice in with it. The FTT has very bad melee defense for tier. It's also cursed with relatively low HP for its tier. But everything else, not so much. Its custom parts slots allocation is a little bit wonky, mostly front-loaded towards close combat. 10 base close slots, 9 base medium slots, and 5 base long slots. This allocation makes it really hard to maximize it, but it also means that it's really easy to make up for its biggest vulnerability. It is absolutely effortless to take that terrible 3 melee defense you start with, and pump it up to the point where it's above your starting ballistic and beam defense. Skill-wise, it's blessed to be one of the only Goufs with emergency evasion. This actually lets it use an interesting trick while you're using flight system. When flying around, when your heat's about to hit critical, if you activate emergency evasion while you're in the air, your last few moments of being in the air will take advantage of that dodge roll. On the ground, the suit moves a lot like a Dom, right down to having the pirouette dodge roll if you use an evasion on the ground. An interesting quirk about the Gouf FTT, and indeed all flight suits, is that their emergency overheat cooldown is much faster than their standard cooldown. So you are incentivized to overheat the boosters. This also means the Gouf FTT is a good tackler. The critical vulnerability of the Gouf FT is that if you're hit by a hard enough attack, you will fall out of the air. Essentially, anything equal to or bigger than a bazooka shell will do the job. That should be your incentive to keep moving. You're also fairly vulnerable to machine guns for reasons that should be obvious. Lastly, you are going to want to keep your eyes peeled for shotguns. Ifrits will basically play duck hunt with you if you're not careful. The fact that this suit has flight system may lead you to believe that it might be good as a vanguard unit, but the Gouf FTT is a little bit on the fragile side, and as such, it's best used as a second-line combatant. Ideally, roll with your teammates. A big advantage this suit has is you can fly over them and ergo attack the same targets your teammates are with a much lower chance of hitting them by accident. The fact that it can fly is a major advantage in and of itself. There are a number of areas in basically every map that you can only get to in a flying suit. Even better than this, several areas that are, for the most part, very annoying for other suits to get to are no problem whatsoever for a flyer. And while I'd argue that there's nowhere that better demonstrates this than Mountain, pretty much all of the new maps have major advantages to using a flyer. For example, it can actually be really hard to get from the underground area on Supply Depot to the surface. You can easily do this on a flyer. And doing this opens up a ton of opportunity for pop-up attacks. Not only this, but you can just as easily fly from the ground to any of the control towers. Getting onto any of the higher buildings with normal suits usually takes a very annoying and time-consuming two-stage jump. One made all the more critical because, on Supply Depot, 2 of the control points are on the rooftops. If anything, the advantages on the likes of military base are even more stark. To get to the best camping spots on the map, most suits have to take a roundabout route to get there. Flying suits can literally jump between them. And this is all with the Gouf FTT, which is the lowest cost and thus least mobile flyer. Almost every map in the pool has some kind of advantage that you can only take advantage of in a flyer. Jungle is almost entirely soft cover with minimal hard cover and wide open expanses. Flyers can easily pick out targets that other suits can't even see. On Tropical Desert, you don't need to take any specific path to get to any of the camping spots or the central mountain. You can just fly up there. About the only map I can't recommend a flyer on is Navalport. On paper, flyers should be awesome on this map, but they're not. In practice, you can't really see anything top down into the water on this map. The one major advantage you do have is that you can easily cap the point in the north, but in practice, if you hard charge that location with an amphibious suit, you'll get there around the time the point is being capped by the flyer, and you will be able to take it back. And of course, flight mode can't be activated underwater, which makes it a terrible location to bring flying suits in general. The Gouf FTT is also basically a soft counter to any suit that's trying to hold a defensible position. Supports have type advantage, and as a result, you won't do as much damage to them, but they're still very vulnerable when being flushed out of cover, and good god is this suit great at that. You are particularly dangerous to melee-focused raids. Suits like the Ifrit Noct, which are normally very dangerous, can quickly be put in their place through judicious use of this suit's abilities. This is made more so by an interesting quirk of the Gouf FTT, which is that virtually all of its weapons do bonus part damage. As a result, your ordnance combos are very capable of causing a leg break. And as always, that is a very viable way to essentially mission kill an enemy. The other thing this suit happens to excel at is mop-up. Pick on vulnerable targets, and there is basically nothing they can do as you gradually whittle them down. Some last remaining tips for this suit before I get into the next section. How long you can fly is based on your thruster gauge, so as a result, any part that you equip that increases how much thruster gauge you have will increase your flight time. Because the FTT's boosters will cool down faster from an emergency overheat, as opposed to a standard cooldown, custom parts that would reduce your emergency cooldown are thus more valuable than custom parts that would reduce your standard cooldowns. If you are in a 400-point match, it pairs beautifully with the Gouf Flight Type. The two suits actively feed off one another's combat styles and actually make for a very dangerous duo. So with all of this said, where does the Gouf FTT wind up on our tier chart? And before I can answer that, I gotta break down its matchups. The Gouf FTT is extremely good against melee-heavy raids. This includes, but is not limited to, the Gouf, Zaku 2 SM, Gelgoog G, Ifrit Noct, Agugai, Zigok, and Gyan. For supports, it is particularly weak against the Desert GM, GM Sniper 2, GM Cannon 2, Gelgoog Ground Type, and Dom Barrage. Now for tier placement, let's not beat around the bush and get right into it. At 350, excellent tier. Between its mobility, firepower, and general utility, nothing can really match what this thing does. It's something of a glass cannon, but it absolutely earns its pay. 400, still excellent. Despite the increase in cost, it's still relevant, being the first flyer available and being a very preferential type. It's a natural counter for the Gouf Flight Type, ironically enough. And while there are other flyers in this tier, specifically the Gaza C being the first transforming flyer, they're nowhere near as effective. So no one can really take this thing's place, and its damage remains quite respectable. 450, it is now OK tier. Not only is it 50 points under cost, but there's actual flyers worth a damn showing up at this tier, namely the Gaza D and Gazaum. While they don't supplant your main tactic, they do out-damage you, and they do have less drawbacks as part of the bargain. So as a result, OK tier, at best. 500 plus, poor tier. The Bjarlant shows up here and essentially is the flyer of the tier. This isn't to say that it's completely unusable at 500. Like I said, it used to have quite a place at Mix-Up back when that was the meta of the time. But we're not in that meta anymore. Bringing this into 500 now implies you're going to be facing off against Jagans and Gyaradogas. It also means that you're going to have to deal with the Gundam Mark II, which is pretty close to being a hard counter when you consider the fact that it can instantly knock you down with the bazooka, and follow it up with an extremely damaging melee strike, which you will almost certainly be weak to. Beyond 500, it really would struggle for relevance in the current meta. Now, we might luck out. We might eventually wind up with a level 3 450-point version, or a level 4 500-point version. And if either of those happen, we will eventually have to come back and take a look at this suit again. But as things stand, 500 and up is poor tier. And I would increase it to awful tier if you're trying to take this thing into 550, which normally you can't. Overall, the Gouf Flight Test Type is a particularly interesting suit, and one that doesn't really play like anything else. If other generals just haven't been cutting it for you at 350, give this one a try. You might be pleasantly surprised, and if you do walk away with an appreciation for it, you likewise will wind up with an appreciation for all the other flight suits, which may open new avenues for you. So give it a try, and tell your enemies to stop goofing off.